Now, I would like to introduce Yidi Wu, who is a PhD candidate in modern Chinese history at UC Irvine, who will be talking about From Moscow to Beijing, Chinese students respond to crises in the Soviet bloc.
Well, it's truly an honor to be here. I want to first thank Professor Tom Gold for inviting me, and thank Paul Chang for arranging the whole trip. Originally, it was my advisor's job to come here to give the talk, but he's too busy, so he sent me his student instead to do the job. But I feel like I have to confess that I'm a little bit naive, but also brave to accept the offer, because I was born and raised in Beijing to high school, and I came to the States for college, so I totally missed the high school education here in the States. I have little idea about how it went about. But first, let's see. I want to give you a little bit of the bigger picture of my project, which is to say why you need to care about the topic, right? Yesterday, Professor Tom Gold was talking about the comparison and contrast between the 1919 to 1989. What are the continuities and the differences between the two events? But what I'm more concerned about is what happened in between that 70 years. What are the major missing links in between those 70 years? You might know about the December 9th movement in 1935, when the students protested against the Nationalist Party to fight against the Japanese. Or you might know about the Red Guards in the Cultural Revolution, which is a different type of student activism. But what about 1950s? Have you ever heard of any student activism in 1950s? Rarely people would come up with any image of that. Well, the stereotypes for the 1950s would go like everyone follows Mao's order, because that's really the founding years, the early years of the Maoist period. So what was really happening? For me, to study student activism in the Maoist era is really to see what are the differences at this period, of what's the unique about student activism in that particular period. I would say the students were really seeking those political opportunities from above, given by Mao in those political campaigns that students acted on their own to interpret the campaign in their own ways. So another way to think about my project is how students interacted with the authorities, the interactions between the political campaigns and the social movements. And the other point I want to phrase my project is how China was situated in the world history at this moment between 1956 to 1957. Especially how Khrushchev's secret speech and the Hungarian Revolution made an impact on Chinese politics, and how Mao and the college students responded to the political crisis in the communist camp. Well, first, let's go to the communist crisis of 1956, the international context. It all began in February 1956, when Khrushchev delivered a speech at the 20 Congress denouncing Stalin's personality cult. And the speech of de-Stalinization triggered a series of political unrest in Eastern Europe in support of de-Sovietization. One example was the Polish October in 1956, which initiated liberalization and reform in Poland. And shortly afterward, when the Hungarian students demonstrated on streets, they were crushed by the Soviet troops. The Hungarian Revolution was no less shocking than the secret speech, because it inspired students elsewhere to learn from their counterparts, while it also warned the authorities in other communist countries about the potential occurrence of similar episodes on their own ground. Next, I would go to the background for the domestic politics in China at the time. In May 1956, Mao officially announced the 100 Flowers policy to encourage academic debates in the humanities and sciences and to approach the Soviet model more critically. The intellectuals' initial response was ambivalent, because at first they welcomed the freedom but remained skeptical of the policy's sincerity and sustainability. To further push the policy at the end of 1956, Mao raised the idea of a rectification campaign, this time inviting people outside the party to offer criticism. The People's Daily published an official call on May 1st, 1957, and only then did the students actually joined other intellectuals in airing their grievances, which probably took Mao by surprise. And after barely a month, on June 8th, an editorial entitled, "What is this for?" appeared in the party newspaper. It signified the beginning of the anti-rightist campaign, in which all previous outspoken participants were labeled quote-unquote rightists and hence political suspects. As you will see, Mao's decision to launch the 100 Flowers campaign and the rectification were partly influenced by Khrushchev's secret speech and the Hungarian Revolution. Now move on, I want to talk about how did the students learn about these international politics? Well, the Chinese translation of the secret speech was published in a classified periodical reference materials with a notice, internal publication, please preserve. At the same time, an English version of the secret speech was published by New York Daily Worker, a US Communist Party newspaper, and it was sold out at a Beijing foreign language bookstore. Some students in Beijing University were trying to translate the report from this newspaper and publish it through the big character posters. And some students read the translation of a book called The Stalin Era, written by an American journalist, Anna Louise Strong. But however, most students did not read the full text of Khrushchev's secret speech, though many were aware of its existence and its criticism of personality cult. Some students also started to question the credibility of official newspapers. As you can see, one of the quote from a Beida student here, he said, "After the recent incidents in Poland and Hungary, People's Daily tried all means to avoid reporting the negative side, but instead covering how people supported the government. Chinese people had to read between lines and guess what actually happened." As you can see, that explains why some of the students made an effort translating the secret speech by themselves, rather than believing the official narrative. The access and interpretation of the secret speech and the Hungarian Revolution among the Chinese students reveals that even within a society that had no freedom of press at the time, the authorities were unable to completely control the information flow at the grassroots level. Now, moving on, I want to talk about the responses to the secret speech. First, for Mao, his reaction to the secret speech was very ambivalent. As you can see the quote here, "To expose the cult of Stalin, to tear off the lid, to liberate the people, this is a liberation movement." But Khrushchev's method of exposing Stalin is incorrect. He hasn't made a good analysis, clubbing him to death with a single blow. So on the one hand, Mao felt quite relieved that he no longer had to follow Stalin's lead, but on the other hand, Mao worried about the way Khrushchev had attacked Stalin after his death, and it posed the problem of the personality cult. For that reason, if Mao disliked Stalin, he despised Khrushchev even more. While Mao was vocally ambivalent about the speech, it inspired him to launch the 100 Flower campaign in order to minimize China's blind following of the Soviet Union. Then what about the students? After their initial surprise and confusion, some of the students relate the criticism to similar problems at home, especially in terms of Mao's personality cult. As you can see, the first quote, "In China, we hang portraits of Chairman Mao everywhere. Yell, long life Chairman Mao, put the chairman on the same level as the country, and say everything we do is for Chairman Mao." What is this if it's not a personality cult? Well, unlike other students who compared similar symptoms in both countries, Lin Xiling, one of the most active female students during the rectification campaign, she attempted to trace the roots of the problem. As you can see the quote here, she said, "The cult of personality is a product of social system. The problem of Stalin is not the problem of Stalin the individual. I venture to say our society, Our society is a socialist one erected on a feudal foundation, an atypical type of socialism, and we must fight for real socialism." Lin is a very active female student during this campaign. She's a senior law student at People's University, and she gave altogether 6 speeches at Beijing University and her own school during this very campaign. Now moving on to the reflections on the Hungarian Revolution. First, for Mao, again, Besides Khrushchev's secret speech, Mao gave another ambiguous evaluation on the Hungarian Revolution, as you can see here. He said it was both good and bad. Of course it was bad since they had disturbances, but Hungary did one very good thing. The counter-revolutionaries really helped us. Since the end of the Hungarian incident, things have been more secure than before. Hungary now is better than the Hungary of the past when there were no disturbances. Well, it's clear that Mao spoke of the student protests as disturbances, and he supported the Soviet military intervention, which made things more secure. The Hungarian uprising was positive as long as it did not happen in China, and Mao seemed to think that similar events would not take place in China. As shown in the second quote, he said, big nationwide riots like those that took place in Hungary will not happen in China. That was his prediction as late as January 27, 1957. I argue that the Hungarian Revolution accelerated Mao's launching of the rectification campaign in 1957 as a forestallment of similar revolts at home. And Mao's confidence and optimism about the domestic political situation before the rectification indicated his sincerity to invite criticism. His belief that China was different from Hungary and rectification would be a method to prevent such chaos was at the foundation of this campaign. But ironically, to Mao's surprise, this rectification campaign really fomented rather than forestalled similar scenarios. Then what about the students? Some of the students speak against the official evaluation, which blamed imperialism alone for triggering the event, but they thought that was self-deceiving. Some other students expressed disapproval of the Soviet military crackdown in Hungary. As you can see in the first quote here, when the US sends troops to other countries, we say that's a violation of others' domestic politics. But when the Soviet dispatches military, we say it's offering help. But obviously, the Soviets intervening in other countries' domestic politics. So this comparison between the US and Soviet is quite revealing. And most provocatively, Lin Xiling, again, I use her quote, she reminded people that the recently gained democracy in China, referring to the rectification period in May, came partly as a result of the Hungarian bloodshed. As she said, the Hungarian people's blood was not spilled for nothing. The tiny democracy that we have gained today is inseparable from them. The masses are not pushovers to really solve the problem. We need the makers of history, the masses, to take action. By calling on their peers to follow Hungary's lead, the students compelled the party authority to see the link between Hungary and China in the process of de-Stalinization. And the last part, how does Mao reflect upon the students, and how do the students think about themselves? In other words, what's the nature of the student activism at this time period? For Mao, he felt quite conflicted about the students, as he wasn't sure if the Chinese students followed the Hungarian counterparts. As the first you can see, he said the student movement were not arranged by the party committees and proceeded like a violent storm, which actually had the flavor of the Hungarian incident in miniature. Some would argue that students blooming and contending forced Mao to change his mind, but the second quote indicates that's not the case. As you can see, he said, before I got to the root of student movements in 4 universities in Beijing, I dispatched personnel to read the big character newspapers to figure out how significant the influence of the Hungarian incident was. Only after May 20, when I found out the real situation, did I truly stop worrying. So Mao might have believed that the influence of the student movement were limited, and as long as the students did not make alliances with other social groups, they would not pose a real threat to the party leadership. Then from the students' perspective, however, they did not think of themselves as promoting a Hungarian Revolution type in China. Lin Xiling, she distinguished what happened at Beijing University from that in Budapest. She said, many cadres felt Beta was in complete chaos, even worse than that in Poland and Hungary. I want to give those nervous cadres a reassuring appeal that this is fundamentally different from the Hungarian incident. I do not see the recent developments at Beta as dangerous. There were some radical and perhaps mistaken views, but no one intends to overthrow the socialism. Many of my own interviewees confirmed the last point, that they were by no means anti-government or anti-socialism. But a more objective observation of university students during the rectification campaign comes from this Polish exchange student at Beijing University in 1957, whose name Rene Goldman. As he said, there were students openly expressing their dissatisfaction and also some taking the party stand, probably mainly the party and youth league members. However, we can assure that the majority of the students stood somewhere in between, displaying a whole range of feelings from utter confusion and hesitation to semi-approval and unexpressed sympathy, an attitude which might term wait and see. But critical voices from the significant minority really mattered, not only because they presented the best minds and most independent thinking possible in the Mao era, but also because their critiques of the party privilege and the socialism in China are still pertinent to the present day after almost 60 years. Coming to the conclusion, I want to argue that despite the contrasts between the views of Mao and those of the radical students regarding Khrushchev's secret speech and the Hungarian Revolution, ultimately, both Mao and the students were doing the same thing by reevaluating the communist crisis in the Soviet bloc and searching for a better socialist alternative for China. Except they came up with very different interpretations. The secret speech was just as liberating and reorienting to Mao as to some of the students. And the Hungarian Revolution offered other communist countries with an example they could either follow or prevent. But unfortunately, neither Mao nor the students achieved what they had intended to accomplish. Mao launched an open-door rectification in order to forestall the Hungarian-type upheavals, but their critiques were more than he could possibly digest, and the students participated in the rectification and wished to help the party improve, but instead, 1957 became a turning point in the PRC history when the intellectual freedom was doomed and Mao's personality cult rose and challenged. Now, with that conclusion, I want to end with my personal fieldwork anecdote adventure. As a native Chinese, it was still an adventure to do my fieldwork, this sort of research in China. So the day after I went back from Hong Kong back to Beijing in September last year, my dad got a call from the secret police warning me against interviewing one of my contacts. I only emailed this contact in August through emails, so we were wondering how the police figured out my dad's phone number. But it's probably because they were censoring my interviewees' emails, so they know my information. And instead of warning me directly, they went to my dad. So in September, I was a little bit scared because originally I want to reach out to that interviewee as my first contact and then go on to someone else. But instead, I have to basically change my phone number and stay quiet for that month. But I still get to do some of the interviews in September, and one of the interviewees turned out very interesting, who's a writist from People's University in 1957. He happened to date this girl named Lin Zhao, who's also a Beida student, writist in 57, who later on became a Cultural Revolutionary martyr because she was executed in the Cultural Revolution, and the police went to her family to charge for the bullet fee. Oh, so this guy, the interviewee I went to meet was the boyfriend in 1958 when they were dating, when they were together working in the library as both are writists. And the picture on the left is one of the pictures when they were dating. They went to one of the parks in Beijing and took this photo together. They were both 26 years old. I was really touched by his love story at the time. They were both 26 years old, almost around my age. And I was really touched by his story, and he keep telling me you should write it down from a female perspective, because he doesn't feel like he has more time to write it down. A month later, after I interviewed him, he passed away, and I felt very obligated to go to his funeral. And we took this picture on the right together when I was interviewing him. I promised him that I would give him the picture because I would stay in China for almost 9 months, but I couldn't do that because he passed away. I went to his funeral. I did meet his wife and gave the picture, but at the funeral, I met some other people who were not related to the family. Well, I was the only, I was not the only non-family member, but I was definitely the youngest. Some of the other non-family members were actually the organizers of some of the rightists, and they host monthly gatherings among themselves, even to today, all those over 80 years old people. So I was invited to join their monthly gatherings. And so for the following month in November, I went to their gathering because I want to reach out to my interviewees to establish my network. It turned out the guy who I was warned against interviewing showed up there. And I basically made my connection right there without leaving any emails or phone calls, right? I was managed to do this, and I felt quite successful in doing this. And guess what? No secret pleas whatsoever came afterward. I felt, the takeaway from this story is really the Chinese authorities is omnipotent, but also impotent for a lot of times, right? So there, even there is this secret pleas everywhere, there's a way to get around. All right, that's it.